Joining us now, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and columnist for the Washington Post, Max Boot. He's the author of the new book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right. And Max, thanks for joining us. Nick Confessori has the first question for you. Nick?
So, Max, we were actually looking at some of the celebratory tweets and posts on Instagram, Senator Cornyn with the champagne, which I think will go into the feeds of millions of women who've been the victims of sexual assault.
Right.
But tell us, we saw on Saturday and Sunday that traditional conservatives were treating this win as their win, as a great win for traditional conservatism. But in your book and in your writing, I think you think of it as more of a win for Trumpian conservatism. Tell us why.
Well, I think Brett Kavanaugh, on the merits, would have been the kind of nominee who would have been put forward probably by any other Republican president. So I can understand why a lot of conservatives supported him. But let's remember how the situation changed in the last few weeks after Christine Blasey Ford came forward. There was a credible allegation of sexual assault, and instead of trying to look into it, Republicans tried to sweep it under the carpet. And then Donald Trump actually mocked this woman with her story about being assaulted, and then he invoked George Soros, this anti-Semitic boogeyman, to claim that that Soros was paying for the protest. And so ultimately and then Kavanaugh himself became kind of like a mini Trump before the Senate Judiciary Committee, engaging in this kind of divisive partisan rhetoric. And so at the end of the day, okay, I get it, Kavanaugh was confirmed, but me personally, I was willing to support him before. I wasn't willing to support him after he revealed himself to be this kind of partisan who is going to politicize the court. I think that is something very dangerous, and that's something that a traditional conservative would be very concerned about, because a traditional conservative would be concerned about conserving our institutions, and placing somebody like Brett Kavanaugh on the court now under these circumstances with the cloud over his head and with his partisan divisive rhetoric, I think that will undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. So I don't think this is something that real conservatives ought to be celebrating.
Let's pretend that Donald Trump is indeed a conservative. What are the differences in your conservatism, your philosophy, and his?
Well, the differences, how long do you have here? The differences are so vast, Mike. I grew up in the 1980s under such a different kind of conservatism. Ronald Reagan, sunny, optimistic, inclusive, pro-immigration, pro-free trade, never engaged in this kind of hateful, racist rhetoric that Donald Trump routinely engages in. Donald Trump is against trade. He's against America's international leadership. He's not in favor of limited government. He is giving us trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. He is undermining the rule of law. He is engaging in racism and sexism and xenophobia. He is mobilizing the worst forces in America, bigotry and prejudice, in order to divide Americans for political gain. This is not the kind of conservative that I was familiar with in the 1980s, but the reality is there are these conservative trends in America. There is a tradition in conservatism, including, people like George Wallace and McCarthy, and there's these terrible trends that we were trying to overcome and to sweep under the carpet and to be better than that. And unfortunately now Donald Trump is dragging us back into the mud and redefining conservatism in his own image, which is not the kind of conservatism that I recognize. And that's why I can't be a Republican anymore, and I even question whether I'm really a conservative, because these days conservative basically means Trump toady.
Yeah, you're talking about redefining the party, Max. Also, reshaping the way Republican senators and members of the House behave. And we could talk about Paul Ryan, how he's turned his back on just about every belief that he espoused for years, that he said he'd fight for. He's been very quiet. But you also bring up Lindsey Graham, a guy you've known, a guy you worked with. Lindsey this weekend talking very much like Donald Trump, gloating very much like Donald Trump. And this is a guy who, during the primary process, called Donald Trump a kook and said that his election would destroy the Republican Party. I think Lindsey was right then.
He was right, Joe, and to me, this is just soul-crushing, because, as I write in my book, I've been a part of the Republican Party and the conservative movement my entire adult life. And, I've known people like Lindsey Graham and Paul Ryan. I've admired people like Lindsey Graham and Paul Ryan, and I don't recognize these people. Who the hell are these people? Paul Ryan was somebody who called out Donald Trump for being a racist in 2016. Lindsey Graham was somebody who called him a kook. They were right the first time around. So how on earth could they possibly justify becoming Trump lickspittles? I mean, the fact that Trump has delivered on a handful of conservative priorities, like putting conservatives on the Supreme Court, I recognize that, I acknowledge that. But the cost has been way too high. All that he's doing to undermine the rule of law, our institutions, our standing in the world, how can they possibly support all that?
You know, Max, you and your family immigrated from the Soviet Union. You obviously know the importance of America's tradition of immigrants. Yesterday I was watching Fareed Zakaria, and I saw Fareed talking to Colin Powell, talking to Madeleine Albright. All immigrants are all children of immigrants, all in immigrant families. That has been at the center of the American experience for over 240 years. How damaging is it to the Republican Party that Donald Trump takes a 180 turn along with the rest of the Republican Party from not only American traditions, but from a core principle in Ronald Reagan's thinking?
Well, that's exactly right, Joe. I think it's hugely harmful to the long-term future of the Republican Party as America becomes less white. The Republicans are being identified as the white nationalist party. So that's just in political terms. This is not a smart long-term play. But I don't even just look at it in political terms. I look at it in personal and moral terms. And this has been heartbreaking for me because a lot of the reason why I became a Republican in the 1980s in part was because the Republican Party was so anti-communist, and of course you have somebody in the White House now who is an admirer of Vladimir Putin, something you couldn't have imagined in the 1980s. But it's also that the Republican Party was so welcoming to people like me. Here I was an immigrant from the Soviet Union, and I felt like I was as much of an American as anybody else because Ronald Reagan talked about the contributions of immigrants. He celebrated immigrants. He even legalized undocumented immigrants, and he welcomed refugees like me and my family. And how different is that from the way that Donald Trump behaves, where he is trying to redefine what it means to be an American in blood and soil terms, and essentially, if you're not a white Christian native-born American, then you're somehow a lesser American. That is the message that he is sending. And one of the proudest achievements of my life was, I came here at age 6 in 1976, and I became assimilated. I learned to speak English. I think I speak it reasonably well. And I tried to fit in, blend in. I wanted to be an American, and I thought I achieved that. And I always thought of myself as just an ordinary American. I didn't think of myself as a hyphenated American or as an immigrant or an outsider. And Donald Trump is making me think in precisely those terms. He is making me think that there is something less American about me because I wasn't born here. I'm Jewish. I'm a minority. I'm not the kind of American that Donald Trump celebrates. That is a tragedy for this country, and it's heartbreaking for me.
So, Max, if you believe that Donald Trump has redefined the meaning of the Buckley-Reagan conservatism, you're a conservative, if you believe he's changed the nature and the meaning of that descriptive phrase, do you think it's lasting?
Well, I fear that it is, Mike. I mean, this is we don't know. I mean, obviously we don't know, but I fear that the redefinition that's going on now, if it's ever going to be undone, is going to take many, many years. I think it is imperative that the Republican Party walk away from this as quickly as possible, but I don't think there's any chance they will do that as long as they see that being Trumpified is a winning electoral strategy. I mean, if they are reinforced in the direction they're taking at the ballot box, we're going to see more of that. They're going to double down on white nationalism. They're going to double down on racism, xenophobia, undermining the rule of law. All of these horrible trends you see under Trump, they will be solidified as a core part of the Republican identity. That's why I think it is essential that the Republicans pay a price at the ballot box for what they are doing. And that's why I'm urging, as somebody who is a lifelong Republican, never voted for a Democrat before I voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Having said all that, I am urging everybody to vote straight ticket Democratic in November because I think it is imperative to get some checks and balances. The Republican Party has shown that they will not stop Donald Trump's abuses of power and that they will continue remolding themselves in Donald Trump's image unless they understand there is a price to be paid at the ballot box. And I think essentially the Republican Party as currently constituted needs to be razed to the ground. It needs to be destroyed. It needs to be burned. And then maybe out of the ashes we can build up a more reasonable and responsible center-right party, which is something this country desperately needs.
Max, stay with us. Still ahead, one message that crystallizes where things stand around the world came from Ned Price over the weekend. He tweeted, quote, The Saudis appear to have murdered a U.S. resident and Washington Post contributor. The Chinese have arrested the head of Interpol, and the Russians have used chemical weapons on British soil. The worst impulses of brutal regimes are coming forward because no one is standing up against them. We'll talk about that straight ahead on Morning Joe.
So I want to take the same question to you, actually, as Joe did. I mean, is it actually time for a more aggressive posture towards China, speaking as a longtime member of the traditional Republican foreign policy establishment?
Well, that's a great question. I used to think that we were too soft on China. Now I'm concerned we may be too hard and in the wrong ways because, I mean, there's no question that China presents a growing threat. For example, their power grab in the South China Sea, which is one of the most strategically important waterways in the world, and they've essentially militarized and taken control of it, and we've allowed that to happen. We've also seen the balance of power militarily shifting in the East Asia region in favor of China. So, you know, in the mid-1990s, Bill Clinton sailed aircraft carrier groups through the Taiwan Straits when China was threatening Taiwan. That's not something we would do again today because the threat from China is too grave. And so I think we've ignored that threat. But now we're not focusing on the military threat that China poses. We're focused on the economic threat. And there are certainly abuses there that we need to deal with, including their theft of technology and their espionage. But I'm just concerned that Donald Trump is on the verge of blowing up a relationship with one of our most important trade partners where you have so many American companies so closely interlinked with China, including Apple and other iconic American companies. And it's, you know, Donald Trump is not clear about what he's trying to achieve because sometimes he talks about China's theft of technology, but other times he talks about the fact that China has a trade surplus with the United States. And if you ask any economist, they will tell you the fact that China has a trade surplus is not necessarily a bad thing. That just means that they're producing a lot of high quality, low cost goods that Americans want to buy. And so Donald Trump, I think he's confused about his goals, and he's also confused about how he's going to pursue them, because if we were really serious about standing up to China, we would do so with our partners and allies. And yet the very first thing he did on taking office was exiting the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So he is pitting us against our own allies. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was this trade area meant to bolster our allies against China, and he exited that. So that doesn't make any sense.
Well,